The first sign something was wrong came when the mule froze standing up. They found it near dawn, just outside the barn, its body stiff as carved stone, head still bent low toward a pile of half-eaten hay. The night had dropped colder than any man could recall. The wind off the Bighorn Mountains came like knives that January, hollowing out every gap in a cabin wall and dragging the warmth straight out of a man's bones. In the town of Red Brush, nestled deep in the Wyoming Territory, it wasn't unusual for animals to freeze overnight, but this night was different. This night pushed past what even the old-timers called survivable. Pipes split, ink froze solid in inkwells, and two families who thought themselves safe in traditional log homes woke to ice rimming their children's lips. Except for one house, one small, peculiar cabin perched on a wind-blasted ridge just outside town, where no one in their right mind had ever wanted to build. That house didn't just survive the freeze, it radiated heat. The chimney didn't smoke like others in town because the fire had burned out hours earlier. Yet inside it stayed warm enough that no breath misted, no frost formed, and no soul suffered. The woman who lived there was a widow. Her name was Ruth Maddox, and until that night, folks in Red Brush thought she was either touched by grief or half mad with superstition, because for the past year she'd been building her home in a way no one understood. She'd rejected the normal advice, ignored offers of help, and spent weeks doing things backward, or so it seemed to everyone watching. But after the freeze, they stopped laughing. Because what Ruth had built wasn't just a home, it was a survival machine, and the secret she'd used to keep warm through a deadly winter was older than any of them realized. But to understand why she built the way she did, and what drove her to ignore every custom of frontier living, you have to go back to the moment that changed everything. You have to go back to the fire. It was early February of the previous year when Ruth lost everything. The cabin she'd shared with her husband Thomas burned in the night. No one knew for sure how it started. Some blamed the chimney. Others thought it might have been a tipped lantern or stray spark from the hearth. But by the time neighbors arrived, the fire had already consumed the structure. Thomas died trying to get back inside. Ruth survived, barely, pulled from the snow with her hair scorched and fingers blackened by frost and smoke. She didn't speak for 2 weeks, and when she finally did, the first thing she said was, "That house was never meant to hold life." People tried to console her. Red Brush was a town that looked after its own. The men came to rebuild. The women brought what food they could spare. But Ruth turned them all away. She thanked them kindly, but refused every hand. Then she took what little remained, tools that had escaped the fire, a stack of scorched lumber, the charred bones of a chair, and vanished into the woods beyond town. Folks assumed she was grieving. Some feared she'd lost her mind completely. But within a week, smoke rose from a clearing on the ridge north of town. Ruth had started building again, except it wasn't a cabin, not in the way anyone knew. She dug first. For 3 days, she worked with nothing but a spade and a mattock, carving into the frozen ground until a shallow pit took shape, ringed with stones she carried by hand. When she began setting the foundation, she didn't use full logs. Instead, she stacked flat rocks, mortared with a mix of mud, ash, and something chalk-white no one could identify. Her walls went up next, but she didn't notch them like everyone else. She carved shallow grooves and set each timber flush, sealed with strips of linen soaked in a strange, thick paste. She covered these seams with a second layer of barkless saplings, peeled and planed to near-perfect uniformity, leaving no visible gaps. The townspeople watched from a distance, puzzled. They whispered in the saloon, muttering that the widow had taken up some foreign method, maybe something she'd read in a book, maybe something older. But when they approached to ask, Ruth only smiled. "It's how it's meant to be," she said. "Heat wants to stay, but you have to teach it how." It was nonsense, they thought. Pretty words from a woman unraveling, but she kept building. By midsummer, her roof was unlike any the town had seen. It sloped gently on one side and sharply on the other, as if tilted to catch the sky. Instead of wooden shingles, she layered slate she carried from a stream bed 3 miles off. Between the layers, she packed sheep's wool and something that looked like dried clay mixed with moss and crushed pine cones. It smelled like earth and smoke and old leaves. She sealed every edge with what looked like melted wax. When it rained, her cabin didn't echo like others. It sighed. The door, when she finally added one, was solid oak, reinforced with iron strapping salvaged from a wagon. But it was recessed into the frame, nested like a plug in a bottle, with not a sliver of daylight visible around its edges. She mounted it on stone pivots instead of hinges, so it swung silently and never squeaked. There was no glass window, only a small vent near the roofline, and a circular opening that could be sealed with a leather-covered shutter. People laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of condescension that frontier folk reserve for eccentricity. One man joked that Ruth was building a beaver lodge. Another said she must have taken advice from badgers, but Ruth kept working, and as the days shortened and the wind sharpened, she finished the interior. Inside, she did something no one expected. She built inward, not outward. Most frontier cabins used every square foot for living. Ruth left a 3-foot gap between her outer walls and an interior structure, a second. Shell made of packed earth and woven reed mats, coated in a paste of animal fat and ash. The air between these walls didn't move. She made sure of that. Every seam was sealed, every crack filled. The effect was a dead zone of air, motionless and thick, that acted as an invisible blanket around her true living space. The hearth was the strangest of all. It sat in the center of the room, low and circular, surrounded by a ring of stone benches, but there was no visible chimney, just a channel that rose through a column of compacted stone and exited near the roof vent. Ruth called it her breathing spine. It pulled smoke upward, but slowly, and it absorbed heat as it did so. After she fired it each morning, the stone stayed warm, well past sundown. Neighbors came once in autumn to offer help splitting firewood. She declined again. "I won't need much," she said, which made them laugh. That winter was forecast to be brutal. The signs were all there. Thick bark on the trees, birds migrating early, squirrels nesting deeper than usual. One man left a cord of wood near her cabin anyway. She never touched it. Then came January, and the freeze. It swept down like a hammer, first stripping the air of all sound, then stealing its breath. Horses in the field had ice on their manes by noon. Chickens froze in coops. Men wrapped themselves in buffalo hides and still couldn't stop shaking. In town, fires burned day and night. Wood disappeared faster than men could chop it, and still the cold bit through. On the third night, the temperature dropped lower than any recorded in the region since settlers had arrived. That was the night of the mule, the night when the smoke stopped curling from chimneys in Redbrush, not because the fires died, but because they couldn't keep up. Families huddled together, breath clouding, blankets piled thick, and still the frost crept in. One child nearly died. 2 elderly settlers did, but Ruth's cabin glowed. No fire, no smoke, no light. Yet when the sheriff rode up the next morning, drawn by curiosity and concern, he found her opening the door with bare hands, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "Come in if you like," she said. "It's warm still." He stepped inside and staggered at the shift. It was like walking into a spring afternoon, not just warmer but alive. The walls held the heat, thick and steady, and the air didn't move. It wrapped around him. He sat down, dazed. Ruth offered him tea, still warm from water boiled the night before. The town couldn't stop talking after that. But Ruth wasn't done, because what she'd built wasn't just a cabin with thick walls or clever tricks. It was the result of something older, a knowledge passed to her before Thomas died, something half forgotten even in its own time. And in the days that followed the freeze, as neighbors came one by one to ask how she'd done it, Ruth began to tell the story behind her strange techniques. A story that began, oddly enough, with her late husband's journal, a book almost no one knew existed. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth, tucked inside a cedar box that had somehow survived the fire. Ruth found it buried beneath a pile of charred beams when she returned to the ruins weeks after the flames had cooled. Most of the cabin was ash and warped iron nails, but the box had been wedged beneath a fallen rafter that shielded it from the worst of the heat. The outside was scorched, the leather binding singed, but the pages inside were dry and the ink still legible. She hadn't known it existed. Thomas was not a man who wrote often. In their 10 years together, she'd seen him scribble notes on traps or draw rough maps for neighbors, but never keep a diary. But this was no ordinary diary. It was meticulous. Dozens of pages, each entry dated, written in a small, precise hand. The earliest entry was from 1824, before he'd even met her, and the last dated only 2 weeks before the fire. There were no flourishes, no musings, just observations, facts, and diagrams, the notes of a man who had spent years quietly studying something he'd never spoken of aloud. At first, Ruth didn't understand what she was reading. The early pages were filled with seemingly mundane details, temperatures, frost patterns on glass, the speed at which water froze indoors. He'd recorded how long it took bread to go stale in different corners of their cabin, how fast tea cooled near the hearth versus across the room. He noted where drafts crept in at night, how the floorboards swelled in wet months, and which beams groaned loudest as the temperature dropped. It wasn't until a third of the way through the journal that the pattern emerged. Thomas had been studying heat, not in the abstract but as a living force, how it moved, where it lingered, what drew it in and what pushed it out. He recorded experiments in cabin cabin layout, chinking materials and firewood species. There were even tests involving stones, flat ones, round ones, different colors and weights, each placed at various spots around their hearth, measured for how long they retained warmth. And then, around the halfway mark, the journal changed. It became something else entirely. The entries shifted from observations to recollections. Thomas wrote of a winter spent deep in the Tetons in 1829, when he was young and trapping with a Métis guide named Jean Rouleau. Their shelter had been unlike any he'd seen before, a low circular lodge built partially into the side of a hill, sealed with moss and clay and covered in hides. But it wasn't the shape that stayed with him, it was the warmth, even in 40 below nights. With only a small fire burning for an hour or two each evening, the interior remained comfortable. Jean had called it La Maison du Silence, the House of Silence, because once sealed, the wind never touched it, the fire didn't roar, and the walls didn't creak. The warmth stayed inside like it was anchored. Thomas had been fascinated. Jean explained that the design wasn't his own. It came from a tradition passed through generations, an old blend of native and French-Canadian building customs, made to survive the coldest territories. The key wasn't just insulation, it was what he called containment. A shelter had to hold heat the way a pot held stew. Most cabins, he said, were like sieves. They let warmth leak away faster than it could be replaced. But containment used layers, pressure, and dead airspace to trap heat and release it slowly, evenly. You didn't fight the cold. You tamed the warmth. Thomas had written dozens of pages on that winter, diagrams, cross-sections. He noted that the most important part wasn't the fire itself, but how the structure absorbed and returned its energy. He spoke of thermal mass, though he didn't use the term, describing how the stone benches stayed warm long after the flames died, how thick walls sealed with wet clay and ash cured over time into something denser, tighter. He described tricks Jean had taught him, burning sheep dung to release oils into the clay, using powdered bone to strengthen mud plaster, sealing seams with boiled sap and beeswax to create flexible joints that moved but didn't crack. Ruth read every line, stunned. Her husband had never spoken of this, yet he'd carried it with him, refined it, tested it in silence. And then, in the final section of the journal, he wrote something that chilled her more than the fire ever had. I know now the cabin we built is wrong. I see it every winter. The drafts, the constant wood splitting, the sleepless nights by the hearth. We've built boxes and hoped fire would fix them, but fire is not enough. Heat wants to stay, but only if we show it how. I've waited too long to change things, but if I could rebuild, I'd try. Ruth deserves better than walls that breathe out her warmth like steam. She deserves a home that holds her like I do. If something ever happens to me and she finds this, I hope she tries. It broke something in her. For days, Ruth read the journal by lamplight, turning each page with hands that trembled, not from grief, but from resolve. He had seen it coming. He'd known the flaws, and he'd wanted to protect her, not with more wood or thicker blankets, but with understanding, with structure. That's when the madness began, or what the neighbors later called madness. Ruth disappeared from town for days at a time, returning with stones, bark, moss, and strange materials no one could identify. She tested them like Thomas had, boiled, packed, burned, crushed. She learned what stayed dry and what molded, what cracked under pressure, and what flexed with the wind. One night she walked 3 miles to speak with an Arapaho elder named Tuani, who lived near the ridge. He rarely spoke to settlers, but he'd known Thomas once, and when Ruth mentioned his name, the man invited her in. They sat in silence for a long while. Then Ruth unrolled a diagram on the dirt floor. Tuani studied it and said, "Your husband watched the old world. Now you see it too." He showed her things Thomas hadn't written, how to mix sap and ash for chinking that breathed without leaking, how to angle eaves to guide melting snow into ground channels that cooled air in summer and insulated soil in winter, how to trap warm smoke behind stone with a spiral chimney that turned a fire's waste into stored heat. He even gave her a small pouch of crushed minerals that, when added to clay, made it harden like fired brick after weeks in the wind. Piece by piece, Ruth absorbed it all. She didn't call it engineering or tradition. She didn't label it anything. She simply built the strange double walls, the recessed door, the breathing chimney, the packed earth benches, the wax-sealed joints. Everything had a purpose. Every inch of that cabin served one goal: hold warmth, hold life. What the neighbors didn't know, what Ruth never told anyone, was that her building wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival, because in the year before the freeze, Ruth had been diagnosed by a traveling doctor with chronic inflammation of the lungs, what we'd call pneumonia today. He'd told her flatly she wouldn't survive another winter without better conditions. That news came 2 weeks before the fire. So when Ruth built her cabin, she wasn't just chasing Thomas's dream or honoring old wisdom. She was fighting time. The freeze came a year later. And while Redbrush suffered, Ruth didn't. She lit her hearth once in the morning, cooked oatmeal, and let the fire die. By sundown, the stones still radiated warmth. Her breath never misted, her lungs didn't strain, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she slept through the night without coughing. When the sheriff came and word spread, the town changed its tone. Curiosity replaced mockery. Neighbors came knocking. First the widow Jacobson, whose children had nearly frozen, then the blacksmith, whose pipes had burst. Each visitor brought a question. How did you do it? Why does your cabin stay warm? Will you show us? Ruth didn't answer right away. She made tea, let them sit, watch the walls, feel the silence. She wanted them to understand this wasn't a trick. It was intention, her husband's knowledge, the old ways of mountain people, the intelligence of a structure that worked with nature, not against it. When they asked again, she brought out the journal. She let them read for themselves. Some laughed at the technical drawings, some wept at Thomas's final message, but all agreed on one thing. Ruth had built something special, and not just for herself. By February, men had started sketching plans. They measured her walls, took notes on her materials, and when a second freeze swept through later that month, less brutal but still deadly, 3 families had already adapted parts of her design. Their homes fared better. Warmth lingered longer. One child who'd suffered from persistent coughing began to sleep soundly again. But Ruth had one more secret to share, one detail even the journal hadn't captured. It came from Tawani's last visit, when he'd told her about the heat pool, a hidden layer no settler had ever thought to use. And in part 3, we'll follow how Ruth added it to her home, and how it made the final difference between surviving the cold and never feeling it at all. The final element, the part of Ruth's cabin no one noticed, even when they walked across it, was buried beneath their boots. It had no name in the journal. Thomas hadn't reached that far in his thinking, and though Tawani called it the heat pool, Ruth understood it less as a pool and more as a memory, an underlayer of stone and soil that remembered warmth and refused to give it up easily. It was not an invention, it was rediscovery, an old method, nearly forgotten, used in earth lodges by those who lived on the plains long before log cabins dotted the west. It began with the floor. Most frontier cabins had dirt floors, packed earth, sometimes covered in rushes or skins. A few wealthier settlers used split log puncheons laid over simple beams. But Ruth took a different approach, one almost no one in Redbrush could have anticipated. Before she laid a single timber for the floor joists, she dug, not deep, only about 16 inches, but across the full footprint of the cabin. It was painstaking work, even with help from a few sympathetic neighbors who still thought she was merely working through the grief. Into this shallow pit, she layered materials with careful order. First came crushed charcoal, spread evenly across the bottom, not for insulation but as a moisture buffer. Charcoal absorbed dampness from the ground, preventing rot in the layers above. On top of that, she laid flat river stones, dozens of them, each warmed by fire the day before, allowed to cool, then embedded into a bed of coarse sand and fine ash. Between the stones, she packed dried pine needles and straw, not thickly, just enough to fill gaps. Then another layer of sand, another layer of stone, a lattice of heat, each layer meant to catch warmth and bleed it slowly upward. The final topping was what she called her breath layer, a blend of packed clay and crushed limestone, mixed wet and tamped down with heavy boards weighted by stones. Over several weeks, it hardened into a dense, solid surface that felt neither cold nor soft underfoot. But the secret wasn't in the texture. It was in what happened beneath it. Ruth had created a thermal battery. The mass of layered stone and soil beneath her feet absorbed heat from the hearth, the sun, and the warm bodies that moved above it. And once it absorbed that heat, it held onto it, releasing it slowly, steadily, through the night and into the coldest dawns. Most cabins lost their warmth within hours of the fire dying. Ruth's retained it through days. It was this layer, more than the walls, more than the roof, that turned her home from clever to miraculous. Tawani had described it like this: the earth will give back what you give to it, but it does not like to be rushed. Feed it warmth slowly, and it will return it when you need it most. He explained how old lodges on the plains had once used sun-heated clay floors to sustain warmth, even when no fire burned. How buffalo robes and heated stones had once lined sleeping pits dug into the floor, keeping children warm without ever lighting a flame. Ruth had listened carefully. She didn't have buffalo robes, but she had stone, she had ash, and she had the time to test. Every evening for weeks, she lit a small fire in her central hearth, nothing more than 2 logs and some kindling. She let it burn for 3 hours, then she let it die. She recorded the floor's temperature with her hand, her bare feet, and later with a mercury thermometer borrowed from the town apothecary. She tracked how long the heat lingered, and she adjusted. More pine needle fill, less straw, a thicker top coat of clay, until she reached the balance where the floor stayed warm for nearly 18 hours after a fire. Not hot, but not cold, just steady. Neighbors wouldn't have believed it if they hadn't felt it themselves. When they stepped inside after the freeze, expecting to see firewood stacked to the ceiling, they instead found a hearth cold to the touch and a floor warm as fresh bread. No drafts, no musty smoke, no dampness rising from the ground, just comfort. But Ruth had done more than build a warm cabin. She had created something reproducible. As word spread, families in Redbrush began copying pieces of her design. Not everyone had the means or energy to dig up their entire floor, but they started with what they could. Some added a layer of straw and rugs. Others began insulating beneath their beds with stone benches or filled sacks of grain. Ruth taught them to heat flat rocks in their hearths, wrap them in wool, and place them beneath sleeping pallets. Crude but effective batteries of warmth. She showed them how to seal window seams with sap-soaked cloth, how to layer bark between wall logs to reduce wind transfer, and how to modify chimneys to draw heat across more surface before it escaped. But what truly shifted in Redbrush was the mindset. For decades, settlers had treated fire as the answer to cold. More firewood, hotter fires, longer burn times. But Ruth taught them to treat structure as the solution. Fire was temporary. Architecture was permanent. You didn't just burn against the cold, you built against it. Still, not all accepted her ways. Some of the older settlers, proud of their traditions, refused to change. One man, Gerald Halcombe, who had built half the homes in town, dismissed Ruth's techniques as a woman's vanity project. He insisted no home without a roaring hearth and 3 cords of wood per month could survive a Wyoming winter. He even told neighbors she'd somehow cheated the freeze, maybe using imported goods or store-bought insulation. Then his roof caved in during a February snowstorm, not from weight but from rot, caused by years of moisture collecting between unsealed shingles and unventilated rafters. His daughter caught pneumonia in the drafty upstairs room. They moved into the schoolhouse temporarily, where the stove barely kept the chill at bay. It wasn't pride that sent him to Ruth's door weeks later. It was desperation, and to his credit he apologized. She let him in, made him tea, walked him through the journal, showed him diagrams she'd modified to account for larger families and multi-room structures. By the time he left, he was silent. A week later, he began redesigning his next house from the ground up. But even as Redbrush adapted, a darker threat loomed on the horizon, one no cabin design could ignore. A traveler arrived in early March, a fur trapper passing through on his way south. He carried word of a sickness moving west from St. Louis. It began with coughs, then fevers, then lungs that filled and would not clear. Pneumonia, they thought at first, but it moved fast, too fast. Whole towns along the Missouri were shuttered. Forts had closed their gates. Trappers avoided settlements altogether. Redbrush had been spared thus far by its isolation. But isolation was a double-edged sword. If the sickness reached them, there'd be no doctor, no medicines, only what they could grow, make, or trade. And as the freeze had proven, many of their homes were not built for prolonged illness. A bed in a cold, damp cabin was not a place to heal. It was a place to die. So Ruth made a decision. She wouldn't just teach those who asked. She would teach everyone. She proposed it at a town meeting in late March. Every family should retrofit at least one room in their home to mimic her design. A central hearth with heat-retaining stone, double wall ceiling, floor insulation, and high-ceiling vent plugs. She called it a warm core, a space where the ill could be kept alive, where children could sleep without danger, where the town could endure if the sickness came. Some balked at the cost, others at the labor. But those who had visited her cabin, those who had sat on her warm floor and felt the silent air around them, spoke up. It was not a demand. It was a gift. Ruth offered to help anyone willing, and slowly, one by one, they accepted. Throughout April, she worked alongside blacksmiths, farmers, widows, and children. She taught them how to mix the ash-clay blend, how to fire stones and store heat. She showed them how to detect drafts with a candle flame, how to seal a door without nails. They called her the widow architect, half joke, half reverence. And in May, the sickness did come. It arrived on a mail coach, the driver pale and coughing blood. He died 2 days later. Within a week, 9 others were sick. But Ruth's warm cores, those sealed rooms built to remember heat, became infirmaries. The heat didn't cure, but it protected. Fewer chills, fewer complications. People survived. Only 2 lives were lost in Redbrush that spring. One was the coach driver. The other was a boy born too early, but dozens more recovered. And by summer, when the sickness faded and the grass returned, the town emerged with something more valuable than comfort. It emerged with knowledge. Ruth never called herself a teacher. She said only, "I remembered what Thomas wanted wanted to forget, but her influence spread beyond the town. A merchant passed through, saw her design, and took notes. A government surveyor stopped in, amazed that the town's structures had survived the freeze and the sickness so well. He took measurements, interviews, and soon Ruth's strange, stubborn methods, first mocked, then tolerated, then revered, became the foundation of something larger. By midsummer, Red Brush had changed. There were still saloons and smokehouses, still muddy boots and cattle drives, but the homes no longer looked quite the same. Rooflines were lower. Chimneys had taken on strange new shapes. Windows were smaller, deeper set, framed with rolled hides or bark-sealed shutters. Doors were heavier, some recessed like plugs, others doubled in thick cloth and waxed linen. And underfoot, more and more cabins had warm floors, heat-trapping stone or packed clay hardened to the color of old bones. The town owed that shift to one woman, Ruth Maddox, the widow on the ridge. But what none of them knew was that Ruth herself hadn't finished learning. Her work had spread, her influence undeniable, but her greatest test still waited, one she never would have chosen. It started with a letter, carried in late July by a prospector passing through. It had no return name, just an address from far east in Kansas Territory. Ruth didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but as she read, her knees weakened, and she sat down hard on the cabin's warm floor. The letter was from Thomas's sister, a woman Ruth hadn't seen since before their wedding. She wrote with stiff, formal phrasing, as if unsure whether she'd be forgiven for the silence of years. But the message was simple. Their nephew, Eli, had survived the sickness in Kansas, but only barely. His mother, Thomas's sister, was dead, and his father had been lost in the first wave of fevered deaths when the illness rolled through their town like a tide of fire. Eli had no one left. He was 12. They were sending him west. Ruth read the letter 3 times. Then she placed it on the hearth and stared at the embers. Thomas had always wanted children. They'd tried once. A winter miscarriage, silent and bloodless. Ruth never spoke of it again, but she remembered every detail. And now, a boy with his blood was on a wagon heading toward her home. He arrived in September. Eli Fletcher was lean and silent, his face pale beneath a mop of black hair too long for his narrow frame. He had the same eyes Thomas had carried, grey, storm-colored, full of questions he wouldn't ask aloud. Ruth met him at the coach stop with a wool coat and a satchel of dried apples. He said thank you once, then fell quiet for the rest of the walk home. The adjustment was not easy. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't complain, but his presence was like living beside a closed door, always there, always waiting, never opening. Ruth tried small comforts, warm tea, soft bread, the kind of meals Thomas had liked. She told stories of the valley, of the beaver trails and the elk migrations, and the way the ridge bloomed first in spring. Eli nodded, said nothing. It wasn't until the first frost that he spoke with real weight. Ruth had just stoked the fire. He sat by the hearth, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the glow. Then he said, "Your floor's not cold." She turned, surprised. "No. It remembers the fire." He nodded again, then added, "Our floor in Kansas remembered the cold." It was the first time he'd said "our" about anything. She told him then, in slow, careful language, about the stones beneath them, about the clay and the charcoal, and the way ash turned to insulation, if packed right. She explained how heat could live in walls if you taught it how. Eli didn't respond, but the next morning, he was already awake when she rose, kneeling near the hearth, turning one of the firestones in his hand. He didn't ask for lessons, but he watched everything. The first snow came early, October 28th, a grey morning with wind that howled like wolves over the ridge. Red Brush shivered, chimneys choked smoke into the low sky, but Ruth's cabin breathed steady. She'd already begun preparing their warm core, laying fresh straw behind the inner walls, refreshing the clay plugs around the door, boiling sap to reseal the roofline joints. Eli helped, never asking why. By November, he slept soundly, no more coughing in the night, no shivers beneath the covers. He ate more, spoke more, helped Ruth mend her worn coat with thread he found in a trader's kit. And then came the second freeze. It dropped from the north without warning, a freak jet of polar air, cutting across the plains and slamming into the mountains. Temperatures dropped 30 degrees in one day. Ice formed in streams that had only just thawed. Trees cracked like gunshots overnight. The sky stayed white for 2 weeks. The new cabins fared better. Red Brush had learned. Hearths were built with thicker stone, floors were layered, but not every family had finished retrofits. One neighbor, the Boudreaux, still had unsealed windows. Their youngest fell sick by the 3rd day. Others burned through all their firewood in a week. The sawmill ran day and night just to keep pace. Ruth's home held. The hearth burned no more than 3 hours each morning. The heat pool kept the floor warm. Eli no longer flinched when the wind rose outside. At night, the air in the cabin stayed still and quiet, thick with retained warmth. Ruth worried less. Then Eli began coughing, not the light, dry cough of sleep, a wet, rattling sound that scraped his chest raw. It started on the 6th day of the freeze. She gave him tea, wrapped stones in wool and placed them at his feet. He said he felt fine. The next morning he was pale. By day 8, he couldn't rise without help. Ruth sealed the warm core tighter. She moved his bed to the heart of the heat pool. She fed the hearth with better wood, birch, slow-burning, rich. She added mint and pine sap to his tea, wiped sweat from his forehead with cloth soaked in vinegar and snow. But the fever climbed. She'd seen this before, during the last illness in town, and in Thomas's final days, though fire took him, not fever. She knew what pneumonia did, and she knew what it took to survive. Not medicine, not prayers. Heat, she kept it in. Every ember, every breath of warmth. She did not open the door for 3 days. She vented smoke only at night, when the heat was highest. She fed Eli broth and applesauce and wrapped him in blankets that smelled of sun-dried pine. When he cried out in his sleep, calling for people long gone, she whispered his name, held his hand, and pressed warm cloth to his chest. On the 11th day, he opened his eyes and asked for bread. He ate slowly, then slept for 12 hours. When he woke again, the cough was thinner. The color returned to his cheeks. By the end of the week, he sat up. Ruth wept where he couldn't see her. The cabin had held. The warmth had stayed. The floor had remembered. That spring, Ruth made a change. She began writing, a journal like Thomas's, except hers wasn't for experiments. It was for instruction. She documented everything: how to lay a stone, how to mix clay, how to create pressure-sealed walls that expanded without cracking. She made drawings, wrote recipes. She tested new materials: walnut shell chinking, goose feather insulation, oilcloth vapor layers, and she began copying the journal by hand. 10 copies, then 20. She gave them to passing travelers. She sent one with the merchant heading east, another with a trapper riding north. She didn't put her name on them. Just this: the house that holds warmth can hold life. This is how. One copy reached a settler in Colorado Territory. Another ended up in Utah. One came to the hands of a Union Army engineer surveying routes for the Transcontinental Railroad. He sent it to his brother, a carpenter in Ohio. The knowledge began to move, quietly, steadily, like heat through a stone floor. Years later, when new towns rose in Wyoming, architects cited the red brush method in their designs. Academic journals traced its origin to a woman on the western frontier, circa 1830s. No one knew her name, but her cabin still stood on the ridge 30 years after she built it. Eli grew up, left at 16, returned at 25 with a wife and a child, built his home beside Ruth's, not with nails and planks, but with packed clay, recessed stone, and walls that sighed when the wind came. That winter, the child never cried from cold, and Ruth, sitting by the hearth, smiled softly when the door clicked shut, sealing warmth inside once more. The wind off the ridge still howled, even after all those years, even after the trees thickened again, and the new cabins below Red Brush followed new principles. Wind was wind. Ruth had always said that you couldn't change the nature of a thing, only how you responded to it. Her cabin never pretended the cold didn't exist. It simply taught warmth how to stay. By the time Ruth turned 61, her home had become something more than shelter. It was a monument to memory, a classroom without a blackboard, a place where people came to sit in silence and listen to the walls hold heat. Children would walk up the path with their fathers, carrying notebooks and questions. Young couples came with measuring tapes. Ruth never turned them away. She never claimed authority. She said only, "What Thomas saw, I tried to remember. What the land taught me, I passed along." Red Brush had grown. The town had a telegraph line now, and 2 general stores. The schoolhouse had 4 windows and a stove that burned all day, but less fiercely than before, because the walls were better now, built with layers, sealed with wisdom. Ruth's methods had not stayed confined to the valley. They'd traveled. Quietly, they'd moved westward. Some called them earthwise cabins. Others used the term silent walling. A few East Coast publications labeled them prairie mass homes, citing their energy efficiency and self-regulating temperatures. But those were just names. Ruth didn't care for names. She cared for survival. She kept writing. Her journals filled a small chest under the bed. Some were for Eli, lessons in building, but also in living. She wrote about grief and what it did to the body, how it hollowed you out until you needed something to hold yourself together again. Some days she wrote about fire, others about moss. She once spent 4 pages describing the difference between ash that had burned hot and ash that had burned slow, and why it mattered when mixed with wet clay. She never remarried. There were offers, quiet ones from widowers or lonely men who admired her spirit. But Ruth had lost Thomas to fire and never again wanted to build something that might collapse if she leaned on it too hard. Instead, she put her hands into walls, into floors, into the bones of structures that would outlive her. When Eli's children were old enough to understand, she taught them too. They didn't know her as the widow on the ridge. They called her Mam Ruth, and her cabin was a place of warmth in more ways than one. She let them draw their names into fresh chinking with the end of a stick. She showed them how to Listen for hollow spots in a clay wall, how to tell if moss was too green to use, how to smell the difference between dry pine and resinous pine. In the winter of her 65th year, Ruth fell ill. It came slow, not like the freeze, not like fire, just a gradual softening of her strength, a weariness in the bones that no warmth could touch. She stayed in bed. Eli came each morning to light the hearth and warm stones for her feet. The children brought broth. She drank little, spoke less. One morning she asked Eli to bring her Thomas's journal, the one that started it all. He found it wrapped in wax cloth, still lined with her notations, now weathered by years of use. She traced the cover with her fingers, didn't open it, just held it against her chest. "It's all there," she said. "Everything worth saving." That night the wind rose again, harder than it had in years. It beat against the ridge like fists on a drum. The trees outside cracked and swayed. Snow fell sideways, fast and sharp. But inside the cabin, it stayed warm. Ruth died before dawn, peacefully, no pain, no final breath drawn in suffering, just stillness, as quiet as the clay that held the heat around her. The town buried her beside Thomas, beneath a cairn of smooth stone layered like the hearth walls she taught them to build. The inscription was simple: Ruth Maddox. She held the warmth and taught us how after her death, Eli made a decision. He gathered her journals, all of them, the building diagrams, the clay recipes, the reflections on grief, the notes on wind, warmth and silence, and sent them east, to a teacher he'd met in Cheyenne, a man interested in sustainable living who had once sat by Ruth's hearth and called it an impossible silence. Within 2 years, a pamphlet circulated in parts of the frontier titled Shelter That Holds. It included Ruth's diagrams, her methods, and an anonymous dedication that simply read, "From the ridge above Redbrush, where a woman showed the cold how to stay outside." Years later, long after the railroad came and the frontier closed, Ruth's design principles would be cited in architecture schools, her heat pool method adapted for use in solar homes, her multi-layered ceiling system referenced in engineering manuals, the breathing chimney mimicked in passive airflow systems. She'd never studied architecture, but she'd lived it. Eli lived to see that recognition, but more importantly, he lived to feel it. Every winter, when the wind howled and snow curled along the rooftops, he would sit beside the hearth with his own children, now grown, and remember the woman who built a house not just to endure, but to teach. One night, during a particularly cold February, his daughter asked him why the house didn't feel cold like her friends. He told her the truth. "Because someone long ago made sure it wouldn't." He pointed to the floor. "It remembers her. It remembers fire, and that memory is warmth." The girl thought for a moment, then asked, "Can houses love people?" Eli smiled. "Some can," he said, "if someone loved enough to build them right." And in the silence that followed, with no wind inside and no cold on her skin, the girl believed him. Because the house was warm, because it stayed warm, because the woman who built it had once stood alone against fire, loss, and freezing wind, and left behind not a monument, but a method, a secret, shared, a life preserved, a frontier widow's quiet defiance, whispered through walls that never forgot the warmth she gave them.